Varn blog, and today I'm with Foppe Haan, a Dutch leftist and socialist who has recently written an article for Cosmonaut magazine on the PMC debates and how we should address them. And I have had some discourse with Foppe over there on Blue Sky, where we pretend it's not Twitter totally. And I read this article, and it actually addresses some of my concerns with both the people who posit the PMC as a distinct class and with the people who say that we should just totally ignore roughly the trends that the PMC is attempting at. And we can talk about this poorly, I think, to describe, but they're real trends. So, my first question for you is, why did you think you needed to venture into this debate? Because on one hand, PMC discourse is ubiquitous. On the other hand, it actually seems to be. I think it's become something that we either accept without question or something that we reject without complication, and that's not a great way to handle this debate. So, why did you venture into this at all?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of reasons actually. I've been active in the Dutch left for about a decade now after becoming politically interested because of the 2008 crisis, and then only finding out in 2012 that the Dutch Socialist Party was at least explicitly anti-neoliberal. And so I joined the party hoping that I'd find like-minded comrades. That turned out to be a bit of a disappointment the first 8 years or so, because the party doesn't function very well. They keep all of the members isolated in the branches with very little contact between the branches and stuff. But I saw within that party at least that there was a big issue with, on the one hand, actually in the first instance, just the party not being able to deal with any identity politics related stuff. They preferred to ignore it in the usual way, in the usual economistic way, actually. Mm-hmm. And and that wasn't really working very well. So, and at the same time, you have a kind of anti-woke tendency in the party leadership that was soft anti-woke at the time, and it's getting worse, but still kind of they're still doing stuff for people of color. Just they don't really like to talk about it that way. And so the membership is overwhelmingly white, but there are some migrants in it who are active. They're just usually frustrated because they're not really dealing with any stuff that relates to their minority background or ethnic, their integration within in society. But yeah, so that was a puzzle for me to see how to convince the party and just leftists to take the identity politics stuff seriously, but in a different way. And then in 2016-17, I was a bit bored because of my isolation, and I didn't really know any communists at the time. And so I was following the Bernie campaign and also just following American politics generally. And I was familiar with the Black Agenda Report, which of course has its critique of the Black misleadership class as well. And then Thomas Frank's book, Listen Liberal, came out, and that interested me as well because he traces how the the party was kind of hijacked by the up and coming yuppie class or yuppie cohort, but also showing how they were constantly kicking unions in the face or spiting them, and Clinton, of course, did as well. And so that I guess was the first time I encountered the PMC as a, I wasn't really sure what to call it, but just as a distinct social group within the left who was trying to be active in left or liberal spaces, but not really acknowledging that they weren't, and at the same time the left just not really knowing how to deal with that. And only afterwards, because of the, or was it the N+1 article that rebooted the interest in the PMC debates, and then the Dissent magazine also had an article about it. So that's actually the first time that I encountered the actual left or the new left's attempts to deal with that social group when it was coming up. And then I saw just online anyway that this seemed to touch a nerve because of the, I guess, millennial and Zoomer lefties online trying to deal with why all of the old people who were calling themselves progressives were so antithetical to Bernie and his campaign. And so they seem to me to glom onto the PMC notion as a shorthand way to explain that. But yeah, I couldn't really integrate that into Marxism and Marxist theory at the time. Mm-hmm. So that was a puzzle. And then after 2019, I became a member of the Communist Platform, which was in the Socialist Party at the time, but just hiding underground because the Socialist Party doesn't allow factions or anything of the sort. So they were trying to organize the left within the party and in the youth party as well. And so I also came into contact with McNair's work, and yeah, that got me in contact with communists, which was nice. But also read Revolutionary Strategy, and while I really like the book and think it very useful, I found it very frustrating that in that there's only like one reference to identity political issues and how they interface with left strategy. And I mean, the book isn't really about that because it's just a high-level conceptual way of dealing with leftist strategy, of course. But it just struck me that here too there was way too little said about how to integrate this positively. So finally, I just decided to write something myself to get a debate going. And I don't know, I mean, I don't know if I'm right, but I hope I wrote something that's clear enough on my own assumptions that it just can serve as a useful starting point to actually talk about this as Marxists and to take identity politics on one hand, because I think it's very much related to the PMC debate and why that isn't being addressed, or if it is being addressed in a really bad way by encouraging workerist bullshit, like saying that the industrial proletariat is the only part of the working class that can be organized and everybody else should just follow their lead.
Yeah. Well, for me, if you take the stance that we have to build our political subject solely off the quote industrial proletariat, and by that you mean productive factory workers and then you take out management and logistics from that. You're dealing with
there's hardly anybody left.
Yeah, I mean, like you're dealing with like 8% of the population or something. Like it's more than agriculture in the United States, but not a lot more.
Yeah, and that, I mean, back in the early 1900s, 10% of the population would have been enough if you could have organized them as well, maybe to get somewhere, especially in the context we were facing then, with actual scarcity and actual food delivery problems and everything. But now, with energy abundance and no real revolutionary pressures, at least in the rich countries, it's a recipe for disaster to only focus on the industrial part, and it's also just not enough because you need everybody else as well.
Well, it's also just, to me, focusing on the industrial workers alone is like focusing, like I mentioned agriculture, would be like focusing on agriculture and then in the 20th century. It's like it might work in the beginning, but you're in a declining sector of the market, and one that's been largely, I mean, automated. And we've known about the automation shrinking the industrial proletariat since we started being concerned about the industrial proletariat. So it's
Yeah.
it's not it's not something that even should surprise us in many ways. Uh, I was interested in your discussions of PMC because you mentioned how it developed around a coterie of people um, in the late 1960s. John and Barbara Ehrenreich have the most cogent, I think, explanation of what they meant by it. Christopher Lasch and Adolf Reed both played with the idea in the same time period, and Adolf kind of like the Ehrenreichs thought it out in those debates after the Bernie campaign. But what I find interesting is the way Catherine Liu, and that group has taken it. It frankly ends up sounding like and forgive me if you don't know the reference, Foppe, but like a David Brooks column from the 90s. You know, like if you've read Bobo's in Paradise, like I could take Virtue Hoarders and Bobo's in Paradise, in a lot of ways they're almost the same book.
Mm.
And what frustrates me about Liu's book in particular is that it actually is hitting on something interesting, but she doesn't actually do any of the work to really flesh out what she means. And like PMC for her is a floating signifier that means pretty much anyone with an education and anyone who does blue collar work.
Mm-hmm.
And also just all liberals, like altogether. And okay, that's a problem because it's not just, it's workerist, but it's also like it doesn't even know what a worker is. So on one hand, it is workerist as it treats the working class as an identity in and of itself.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that weirdly, it has a shadow narrative that McNair, you talk a lot about McNair's review of it, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But a shadow narrative that like McNair's version of it only kind of picks up on, and that is like Liu is really mad at the PMC, but she also like does think there was a heroic period for them, whatever she means by it, and it's very unclear, particularly now because in her recent discussions and writing, she's got the PMC existing all the way back in like the 17th century. So it's just like, okay, now I don't know what you mean by this class. It seemed to me when I was reading the stuff out of the kind of Ehrenreich, Lasch, Reed coterie, and for people who don't know, those people aren't associated together today, but they tried to start a party together in the late 1960s. That they were knowingly trying to address actually something that came up in the 1940s around James Burnham and Friedrich Pollock separately, the administrative class thesis and the managerial class thesis. And what Ehrenreich pretty much did was synthesize them and then come up with an explanation. Now, one of the things that's always fascinated me about our discussions about this today is that if you read the John and Barbara Ehrenreich book, the conditions for that class are grouping, our social category. I do think it's a valid social category, by the way. I don't think it's a class in the Marxist sense. We can come back to that. But I think it could be. This is one of the interesting things. Like, there is a way in which, if things continue to develop in a certain way, the PMC could distinguish itself as a separate class because of its weird relationship to the state. But Lou just doesn't get into these questions. Interestingly enough, Christian Parenti kind of does, and he has it was like a one-off paragraph where he noted that, like, one of the things about the current PMC is that they're both state dependent, but they've moved from being technically petite bourgeois professionals who own their own businesses and means of production to basically labor aristocratic sections that are wage dependent. They don't even get paid in stock options, but they're highly, highly compensated and have some indirect but strong relationship to the state. So like highly subsidized areas of the economy. Now, you didn't mention that in your piece, but I wanted to talk about, like, okay, what do you think the PMC is, and why did you find McNair's attempt to address Lou so unsatisfactory, even if you agreed with a lot of what McNair said about Lou? So.
Yeah, well, what I try to do in my own article, in large part, is just to create a kind of methodological framework that you can then use and get like the PMC out of it as a group that has broadly the same relationship towards other workers or towards citizens or towards students, or where there's a relationship of either domination / control or exploitation, and the exploitation doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be in terms of being able to privatize surplus value or something, but also, like, if you're a manager or you're a tenured professor who gets in large grants, then you are allowed to claim all of the work that all of the people do for you as part of what you do for in discussions with your own management, or about how you are compensated, or how like, so
yeah, so you seem to hint at something that I've thought a lot about. I read an Eric Olin Wright's second to last book, maybe his last book, Understanding Class. I think it was second to last book. He actually teases apart oppression and domination as a way of talking about something like the PMC, because he's like, well, we can see that this antagonism isn't really the primary exploitation you see in capital, which is still bourgeois versus proletariat. And that dynamic is still going on, but that dynamic is not the way most people experience class. Like, you don't hate your owner of your business, you hate your boss, because you know your boss is actually dominating your life, whereas the owner is so far removed and hidden structurally that you probably have no idea, like, who they are even, and now, unless you work for a small petite bourgeois kind of firm where there's a clear singular owner or a clear CEO with majority stock options that's not public traded. You don't really know who your exploiter is. And I think we do have to talk about that. And I think, I was thinking about why so much of the function of PMC is usually talked about when two specific parts of it, but part of the problem with PMC is like, as you discussed in your paper, is that it's both something we can like actually define as clearly growing, but also something that's like the singular vector that defines it is actually really hard to pin down, because it's not wage labor, it's not even education exactly, although that tends to be the way people divide it up, and that is how Ehrenreich initially divided up, because almost all the people with degrees when she wrote the book with John did end up in either management or in like cultural production in a way that gave them power. And that's led for like when people talk about the PMC, like when Lou's talking about the PMC, she's talking about liberals and college professors pretty much, right? Like the other managers, woke HR is a problem, but the rest of managerial culture, she actually has remarkably little to say about. And that is interesting to me, because I think, Ehrenreich's late work talks about a division within this itself. But one thing that I started thinking about was when you look at the paradigmatic example of PMC, and like I said, we've talked about HR, we'll get to that in a minute, and academia. Well, academia is bizarre as a capitalist formation, because it's a feudal institution, effectively, that was allowed for reasons during the Cold War that aren't entirely clear to be run as kind of a guild co-op that that then had realities forced upon it upon trying to compete in the market, but has this core of these original structures that were set up to run this like collective education departmental fiefdoms that were relatively democratic within those fiefdoms, that creates a clear worker elite. I mean, when I say a clear worker elite, like most tenured professors, for example, spend most of their time doing research, which is a lot of work, don't get me wrong, but that they do that to get grant money. But they also claim the work of tons of students, basically, and put their name in, particularly in the sciences. Like you're constantly having postdocs do the research and writing for you for some tenured professor to claim. And then they also get a very light teaching load in Europe and America, sometimes as small as like 1-1. That's one class a semester.
They can buy it off using some of the grant money.
Right, and they can buy it off, yeah. Whereas adjuncts, who sometimes are making per hour sometimes less than minimum wage, and they are technically contract workers, so they're not entitled. And in the United States, and this is not how it works in Europe, but they're technically contract workers, which means that they are not entitled to normal hourly labor protections, and they make the departments function. So the actual professors that most undergrads will deal with are going to be graduate student assistants or adjuncts for the most part, and until they get into their higher level classes and actually get access to a professor. That's a totally exploitative labor system, both in the sense that everyone is being exploited to generate profits for the university, even in ostensibly nonprofit universities, but also because the top end of the labor pool in that system is so dependent on both the work of other people and often claiming credit for what they do, and they get compensated thusly. Now, compensation for professors is often not as high as Catherine Lou seems to to think it is, which I think is interesting because she's running from California. But nonetheless, I think you pick up on this where you got frustrated with McNair a little bit, because McNair kind of does grant that this is happening. He doesn't just do the workerist thing where he's like, oh no, we just need to focus on pure class antagonism. But he talks about this as an illustration of capitalism in decline. Robert Brenner does that too. Like his neo-feudal thesis, which seems to have evolved into something else. I think he's calling it political capitalism now with Dealing Rally, which is slightly different than neo-feudalism. But he thinks that like capitalism has somehow fundamentally changed because profit rates are so low that government fiat currency is basically floating parts of the economy. So he's basically like saying like MMT is correct, but it's because capitalism's in decline and it won't work forever. I think that's what he's implying. He's actually not incredibly clear about this. You seem to think that saying that the PMC illustrates capitalism is in decline may not be the best way to understand it. So why do you feel that way?
Yeah, I guess this relates to what you mentioned earlier about Christian Parenti, and what he was pointing to. The PMC, because it's such a vague term, and because we aren't really being very very scientific about defining it and applying it to people, it encompasses both very poor workers like adjuncts, and at the other end, like high end or top government functionaries and university tenured professors. It becomes a kind of a useless term, but I mean, I don't think it is. So, how to explain this? I guess the other thing that, I mean, if I just go to what I find frustrating about how McNair is using it, what McNair is also just not taking seriously that these other forms of exploitation, both, I mean, they both still matter historically, and they aren't going away, but there's also just new forms developing courtesy of how capitalist societies have matured to make use of a much bigger state, and to create this whole regulatory bureaucracy that they then use to police people's lives, and also to is my suspicion anyway, to just favor large capitalist corporations because of how the regulatory pressure favors large corporations over small and medium enterprises, because they are just much more able to carry the overhead costs involved with compliance and stuff.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, and on one hand, like, we're seeing an expansion of stuff that Bukharin first wrote about when he started writing about monopoly, his version of monopoly capital, which is different than the Sweezy and Barron version of monopoly capital. But I think this trend of the capitalist using more and more of the state, and before I can already feel the heterodox non-Marxists coming at us like, well, capitalism has always used the state. Yes, we know. What we're saying is more and more of the state. And that there's a deeper interpenetration of the bourgeoisie and government elites than before. And I think that's been true since World War II. I mean, like, I do think James Burnham, for all his faults and being like, I don't agree with everything in the managerial revolution. I think he's basically using fascist class analysis and hiding it for American technocrats. And that's James Burnham, who I think did that. But it was clear enough that also, like, the Frankfurt School came up with it. Baron and Sweezy's Monopoly Capital, like, for all I disagree with it, came up with it. Like, there was something very real that people were responding to about the integration of state and capital, and the integration of things like public-private partnerships, public-private market spaces being expanded, etc. And one of the things that your analysis gets to that I find interesting, you know, in a society that abuses the shit out of Gramsci, so much so that, like, I actually thought I hated Gramsci because of Gramscians. Then I went back and read Gramsci and read the history of the Italian Communist Party. And I was like, oh, I don't hate him. Like, I hate the people who used his work, but nonetheless, I have found it interesting that so few people talk about class hegemony and class cultural hegemony in the discussion of the PMC. And then, like, when you brought it up, I was like, duh, wow, that's like obvious. So these are one of their functions, you know, whatever this subcategory, the social grouping is, one of its functions seems to be related to hegemony. But I think your paper actually gets to this. It's not in a one-to-one or clear way that they can just establish cultural hegemony. That's not really what they do. So how do you think hegemony helps you understand what like gives you an in to understanding what the PMC may actually be getting at?
Well, I guess my sense of what unites the PMC or people with PMC-ish functions is in large part just a notion that they're contributing to the maintenance of class society, and they want to do some part in maintaining that, but they don't have either the option, because of where they're placed and how reliant they are on the existence of the state, and also of large corporations who employ them for their own role to exist in the first place. But also because of how they're trained, or because of how the school system trains you to think about bourgeois society, and just the liberal liberal constitutionalism, I guess, to put it briefly, that they can see a positive role for them that also allows them to have their own little fiefdom, or their own place in it, where they can distinguish themselves from other parts of the class that they've been taught and that they look down on and or exploit and or use as part of their institutional role.
Yeah,
and that's what frustrated me about McNair, because if you say, okay, class society, and I mean that doesn't just frustrate me about McNair, but about the long history of what communists have been doing since Marx's time, or at least since the 1910s. It's just focusing on achieving state power via the notion that you can just build a movement and then take over the state apparatus, and then you can institute socialism, social communism with that small vanguard, or and so everything was put to building a party strong enough or in the right place to do that. But we've seen, I mean, that in the 20th century that really only worked in two big states and a few smaller ones. But overall, it's just been a failure because the movement was too small and also just not united enough and far too easy to play a part to manage to take power in the healthier and more robust economies. And that is because capitalism isn't the only enemy. There's also all these other forms of class rule / class exploitation that still exist within capitalist societies that we have to take seriously as a movement and deal with them to unite the class and build a robust enough movement that it won't be split apart again along other lines at some future point again.
Well, I think one of the things that's interesting that I teased, knowing now, you telling me why you wrote this, because it's clearer now that I know that, you're trying to illustrate that the capital, bourgeois proletariat dynamic is the driving class antagonism, but it's not the only one, and it's never been the only one. And I think we also just have to deal with the fact that there are antagonisms within the classes. And so to get into, you're talking about identity politics. So the standard critique when people invoke the PMC is identity politics is a weapon of the PMC to keep the class divided, blah, blah, blah. And look, I think there's some truth to that.
Sure.
But the idea that then if you just abandon liberal identity politics, that just doing basic workerism will get you to overcome the contradictions that led to those ethnic tensions and whatnot in the first place. It seems to ignore that, like, what was the biggest debate of 20th century Marxism? And that's the national question, what is that but an attempt to deal with one of the identities? And the other big question was the family and gender questions, like in the 19th, 20th century. Those were the biggest selling socialist books. So it seems to me that we've always realized it's a problem, because any of these nation antagonisms could become a class antagonism. And from the orientation of communism, which is not just to create a cool anti-capitalist society that doesn't just have capital, we have to remember that the goal was initially, and it's clear in Marx and Engels, to get rid of classes, not just to put one in charge. Yes, we do think the dictatorship of the proletariat is necessary, but the idea is there are no classes. And what we have seen, I think, with the focus on the state is that, and I think McNair is aware of this, it comes up a little bit in his discussions of like legal power and stuff, and particularly on the one area where he's not an orthodox Marxist, where he critiques Marx for not like seeing stuff clearly there. Is that we do have to deal with these differences and antagonisms in a real way and abolish them. And that requires dealing with the fact that most of what we do once we touch the state is create a counter PMC in a way. I mean, like, I don't like the term PMC for them. I mean, I think nomenclatura is actually probably the correct term, but that's what, like, you create a set of bureaucrats who, while they don't on paper own the means of production, they have so much control over the means of production, they are effectively owners. And that leads to very violent internal antagonisms, because you've also removed, in most of these socialist states, the ability for these people to contest within socialist movements, because you have faction bans and whatnot. So you have basically the only way to control both the general population and the nomenclatura is terror, right? And that was the second international critique of the Bolsheviks, is that they were a minority revolution, and minority revolutions it always can only work with terror. That's how they work. Like, in fact, the appeals there was that's how the bourgeoisie try to control everybody is basically terror. So, why would we expect anything different from a minoritarian government, even if the minoritarian government is in charge of a legitimate revolution? Like,
No, and I'd say history has proven them right on that point.
mm-hmm.
I mean, it could have gone somewhat differently if they'd removed the faction ban. Although, I mean, yeah, it's just hard to say given who were in power and in control of the party bureaucracy at the time already. There, there, there wasn't enough of internal resistance that was organized to really prevent what happened, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm interested in this. You were talking about the anti-woke stance of the Dutch Socialist Party, and I was actually thinking like that's an interesting thing. In so much that's even if it's trying to reject an Americanization of left politics. I've heard this complaint a lot from Europeans.
Mm-hmm.
It actually, in many ways, still legitimizes the American approach because it's like you're reacting to it, so you're taking its framework as what you're positing yourself against, which in some ways validates the framework.
Yeah, and I mean it's not just the Socialist Party doing that. It's also, I mean, the right wing parties in the Netherlands are quite internationalist as well, leaving aside the issue of which American funders give Wilders money and stuff like that. So Wilders is the current, or is the guy who's been in the Dutch politics for 20 years now, but he's currently leading the largest party in Parliament, and he's very, just dog whistling and kicking immigrants. That's his motto. But he's learned quite a lot from American politics as well. So it's not really something you can get around by fighting it, by denying it.
No, well, I've actually been thinking about this, and I think it may be maybe this is a common mystic of me. I won't lie, but it seems to be something about the development of capital orientation around states and state competition right now that has led for the American right and the European right to look a lot more like each other while seemingly, having nothing to do with each other. And by that I mean like the American right of like the aughts, the 90s, the 80s, the Reagan coalition, that's pretty much dead now. And we have a kind of right populist coalition that picks up on cultural lines. That's not conservatives picking up on cultural lines is of course not new. That's the oldest. That's their number one playbook, honestly.
Yeah.
But them not being tied to capital explicitly, that is new. And that seems to be something closer to a European style left. Also, I've just noted that Trump is a European populist figure in the sense of the kind of style that he comes out of. He reminds me of a lot more of like Berlusconi's and that kind of figure than a prior American demagogue. All that said, there's also a sense in which that's easier because you're right. The past 20 years is also Americanized most of the rest of the world's right wing. So like the Canadian right looks a lot more like the US right. The Tories seem a lot more like the US Republicans than they used to. So it just seems like there's less of a distance between the American right and the European right, even though they are, theoretically, like, yeah, there's obviously there's backdoor money going around with funders and whatnot. There's always shenanigans like that. But the internationalism of the right because they're also dressing up as nationalists isn't obvious to a lot of people. So there's that, but it also seems like in Europe, it seems like the socialist parties have gone one of two ways. They've either gone anti-woke or they have picked up American-style identity politics whole cloth and tried to apply it to European matters, which also doesn't really work because we have different racial and ethnic and gender concerns than you in some ways. Oh, gender concerns are probably similar, but racial and ethnic concerns are different. So, even like stuff about like race, like how we define whiteness. Well, the American way, because we're a settler state, is necessarily going to be broad in a way that makes Europeans uncomfortable. Like, that's part of how the settler state worked. Like, it was
with the integration of the different, like the Irish and the Scottish,
the Irish, the Scottish, the Dutch,
Italians,
the Italians. Every now and then, when you're reading, old 19th century authors and who are racist, you forget that, like, oh yeah, they used to hate all the other Europeans too. Like, you just forget. You're like stumbling upon H.P. Lovecraft complaining about the Dutch, and you're just like, so, what? Like, who's got a problem with the Dutch? But yeah, it's an interesting thing, and I've been with you on this for a while, way back when I wrote my response to Mark Fisher's Vampire Castle. Where I said, like, he was throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because he was right that there were this elite coterie of people who used identity politics as a weapon. They're clearly using it, as a friend of mine says, the fight over the scraps of academia and whatnot as it's being neoliberalized. And that's true. But the idea that you could just go back to a worker identity as a valid identity, particularly once you've divorced it from your active class position. And this was important for Fisher too. Fisher, being British, and I think part of it's being British, but part of it was his orientation. He thought your class origins were more important than your actual current class, like where you were in the economy. Mm-hmm. So, that was the whole, like, is Russell Brand working class debate. And
lots of Stalinist bullshit still floating around in the contemporary left, sadly.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting because I don't think that let's talk about that, because Stalinism seems to be able to, right now in America, we have a super woke Stalinism and a super anti-woke Stalinism, and they both exist, and they're both really annoying, honestly. But, like, I mean, they don't have any, like, political power really, but they, you encounter them on campuses, you definitely encounter them on the internet, and it's wild to me because, like, ostensibly these people should have the same politics, right? They're both Marxist-Leninist, anti-revisionist, pre-52ers, and yet their understanding of what, like, the party should do about race and gender and whatnot are diametrically opposed. One of the funny things about that is, frankly, the anti-woke right-wing ones, they're more actually consistent with Stalin policies, but as I pointed out to people, the more I've studied Stalin, the more I'm like, he wasn't consistent on, like, Russification or pro or progressive or regressive views of gender. He actually was all, like, one of the things you realize about the Soviet Union from, like, 1928 to, like, 1952, they're all over the place on these questions. Like,
it's very reactive.
Yeah,
it seems to me, and that's, I guess, I don't know, but maybe that's part of why MLism is so popular, because you don't really need to know anything about the history and about historically taken positions. You can just do it by gut, and that's, I think, what informs most of the newly the new communist left.
The new communist movement.
because because we just don't know the history, so people pick up a few phrases and they might know, like that the CPUSA was actually trying to organize black workers, or they might not. They might have a large trans contingent, so they're because of that, because they still want to be MLs, they then feel, okay, we have to incorporate this, and so they go woke, or at least they're pro-trans, and other parts don't because they're trad something, and or they want that. I mean, the proles were more, or they were split, but
well, I think this is interesting because I think this does relate to this PMC question a little bit, because a lot of people who go down the anti-woke line are trying to signal that they're different from these liberal professional managerial types, right? But they're signaling it by often, as I pointed out, they're not even picking up like Soviet talking points from the 1940s. What they're actually doing is picking up like straight up nationalist talking points from Russia now, and then like draping a red flag over it, or they are this weird like Stalinist pro-Christian stuff that I've seen recently that's wild. Like it's just like, okay, um MAGA communism is another one, and as I pointed out to people, like these things happen in cycles on the left, like Browderism, patriotic socialism. That's not a new phenomenon. It's one that was condemned by Lenin, but the Soviet Union had no problem turning it on and off depending on the period, right? Like, and you're right, when all you're trying to do is like counter really bad American anti-communism by just like basically flipping it on its head, you don't really have to know anything about the Soviet Union or Stalin or China or what the Sino-Soviet split was actually about or who started. I mean, one of the great ironies of the Sino-Soviet split is even though Mao like wants to keep his Stalin, it's really Stalin's decisions that led to everything that facilitated the Sino-Soviet split happening in the first place. So like, way more than Khrushchev, even though we have to, have Khrushchev take the blame. But let's be honest, most of the worst decisions that affected the Chinese Communist Party was during the Stalin period, and particularly in the 1920s. I mean, it was just bad. So I think that pretty much leads to this. I found it interesting that McNair seems to imply that that Liu is a crypto Maoist, and Maoists are tending to like he seems to imply that Maoists tend to make up new social positions to justify new opinions. Like that's something implicit in his critique. I mean, he may even say it. What do you make of that? Like, what do you think the relationship is to Maoism here, if any at all?
Yeah, I found that part. I seem to recall that he's written another essay about it, about the influence of Maoism on the development of identity politics in the U.S. That addresses that directly, but I never really found that very convincing for the same reason, I guess.
Yeah, about so, it. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, no. What I what I've no.
I was thinking about the reason why I didn't find it convincing. My friend Alex Sashade, who came on the show many years ago, is a kind of anarchist China scholar. But they pointed out to me that if you look at what is really going on there, there is some Maoist influence on the language, but basically the kind of national developmental left they like the U.S. version didn't so much come out of Maoism as it adopted Maoist language cynically because it was already heading in similar directions as far as like national developmentalism and this kind of the idea of a more interventionist state, but that also you got rid of Fordism and this that, and the other. So I think this is interesting to me. So ultimately you decide that like in your piece that yeah, the PMC is a problematic too broad concept that's not particularly clear, but if we ignore the questions it brings up, we are ignoring a wide variety of domination and other potential places for class domination of form that isn't necessarily capitalist. And and that if we actually mean if we are actually communists in the sense that our goal is a classless society at the end of all this, we can't allow that to happen. Like, and clearly, you know, both in your article and as you said today, you think that it did happen. Like, basically, you know, we didn't, even when the proletariat bourgeois antagonism was temporarily dealt with in the socialist societies, and I say temporarily because most of them have reestablished bourgeois relations at some point, but that they never got anywhere near the ability to say that you were even beginning towards a classless society. In fact, class divisions just became more opaque.
Yeah, and also, I mean, the position that, or my sense anyway, is that the position that Soviet Party officials had within Soviet society, in terms of, okay, they don't directly benefit from surplus value produced or whatever, but they still benefit from being able to have the position, they are still able to control others, and in that sense, they're not that different from university, maybe not professors, but one layer lower on that totem pole, or just government bureaucrats in bourgeois countries. So they were able to extract use values out of, because of the position they held, and because of the structural relationship they were in vis-a-vis other workers in those states. And structurally, that's no different, or I mean, it is different, but it's the same kind of or it's similar to how if you're a father in a society where women are forced back into the home and thus forced to become economically dependent on you, then you have power over them to force them to provide use values within the home for you. Either, I mean, that can be so crude as producing children for you, but also just taking care of you, taking care of the kids, raising the kids. That kind of relationship is also part of what makes class societies attractive to people, if you're able to hold the dominant position in the relationship anyway, or at least, and that doesn't have to be full time for it to be appealing. So if you have this private domain in which you are the Lord in some sense, then that can be enough for people to throw up their hands and say, okay, there are parts of, or there are forms of class society that I can live with, so I don't want to jettison the whole thing, even if I'm being exploited at work.
Mm-hmm. Well, for me, that this gets into, you know, we mentioned this earlier. that yes, just because we realize that liberal identity politics does actually use a flattening out of class distinctions to operate and to have, you know, basically to help elites of color. Uh, I think that's a real enough thing, and yet the idea that if we just turn it off, it'll go away. Now, some of this is easy to deal with. By that I mean, like, we all know that. Well, maybe we don't know, but it's pretty clear to me that if you fix the wealth gap in the United States by dealing with wealth, it would do more than any probably politically viable form of reparations would do for Black people in the U.S. However, that is not the only thing that Black people deal with in the U.S. that you still have to deal with, right? And I think like the class unity approach. As a side note, one of the interesting things about the class unity approach is almost all the people who put it out don't meet their definition of working class, which I think is fascinating because so many of them are like against the PMC, and I'm like, but you're a college professor. Like, this feels like internecine class battles, honestly. But it also seems to me that like it's a recipe for failure in that it's kind of dishonest about why there are divisions amongst the working class in the first place. So you talk about, you know, the sexual division. I mean, the obvious one is like there's a real sense in which racism in the South fought off the development of a U.S. labor movement, but partly because like white workers having someone to shit on was appealing. Like, you know, because at least you're not at the bottom of the relational totem pole. Like,
and that's why it's actually important for the ruling classes to have new ethnic groups that get placed at the bottom of a totem pole every once in a while, so that there is there is still churn and there are still opportunities for people to feel better than others, and for them to cynically use this to divide the working class.
Yeah, I think you talk about this about stuff, you know, stuff that is substructural to class. You brought up women's work, and I think it's interesting because I think you're in line with Ingalls there. I mean, Ingalls talks about what the first class division is actually the division between men and women in agriculture. Like that's his like that's the first class division is a division imposed by gender in an agricultural society. Like, and interestingly, for all that Ingalls gets wrong in, you know, because not because he's dumb, but because he's operating off of like
bad science.
Yeah, but 19th century anthropology, you know, a lot of that's real bad. That even though he's doing that, interestingly, he kind of realizes some things just from logic that turned out to be true. And one of those things is like, yeah, agriculture really did increase sexual division of labor, and that really probably is, you know, the first two, you know, I think the first two class divisions is soldier, everybody else, and then man, woman. Like those are the first two for me. Like when you look at the development of societies, it's like, okay, who's in the armed forces and how you support them, and how do you socially reproduce, and how you maintain that, what power relations, whether or not they're relatively egalitarian or not, it decides the class society. And once you have agriculture, the egalitarianism of both those things goes away. And Ingalls kind of picks that up. I mean, I think he's completely right about that, even if his reasons for getting there were based off of flawed anthropology. And I find it interesting that McNair then sees that as substructural to class, which I'm like, how is it substructural? It seems like it's just structural to class. How is it a substructure? Like,
because he's too focused on capitalism as the dominant thing, which it is, but that doesn't make the other things not class. So that's kind of what I wanted to emphasize by writing this. There's just these other forms of class exploitation and domination that still matter. And you can say, okay, some are older, that's fine. I mean, I'd throw in that besides the man, woman, and soldier, non-soldier, there's also the human, non-human class division within those early societies that probably really matter to people's everyday experience, because quite a few people in those early societies were using other animals and learning on other animals how to use and manipulate them, how to kill them.
Mhm. Well, I mean, this is actually interesting. You and I have talked a lot off air about that, because I'm one of these people who uh, I'm okay with granting personhood to animals in a way that I think makes a lot of communists uncomfortable. But I'm just like, yeah, I mean, like, they are like, if we're materialist, now I
They're
have some
part of our
metaphysics,
societies. Yeah.
right? If we're materialists, we have to also look at the early forms of society. Most other societies have non-human persons, both what anthropologically we might call meta persons, which are like concepts that we treat as people, but there's also non-human persons as animals we recognize as having person agency, and some societies go so far as recognizing that inanimate objects might be persons, which I wouldn't do, but you have this form of relating, and I do think we have to deal with it. Like, I don't think we can just go on with treating animals completely subservient to us in that way. Yes, I know animals can't choose not to kill each other. That's kind of beside the point, because you can. Um, so this is where I sort of I do think maybe we do need to look to some pre-modern or indigenous. Although I'm gonna asterisk that, because indigenous has become a most abused word on the left right now. But um, uh, it, some kind of pre-modern ways of relating to the natural world that also treat these things as exploitation we should minimize, if not, get rid of. And you know, I think that's important. And I don't think it makes us. The idea that caring about that makes you a liberal just baffles me. Like, it's like, okay, so you're basically saying that all ancient societies who cared about relations with non-humans were liberal. That's weird. Like, yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
Pete is annoying, but like, um,
It's what was the phrase they used against homosexuality? It's a bourgeois concern. This is kind of similar. They just don't want to talk about it because they partake in the exploitation themselves because of how they eat and what they wear and stuff. So
yeah, the idea. Let's talk about workerism a bit, because while I am very much pro working class autonomy, this is a big thing for me. I'm always about the working class should act politically autonomously. Uh, and I don't think that automatically means it's going to act socialistly, and I want people to know that. Like, I'm not stupid. Um, but what I don't love is workerism, which is just the idea that, like, we should valorize workers' identity for its own sake. For one, I come from the lower end of the working class in the United States. There's very little of that life I'd want to like celebrate. And that's not because I'm like anti-working class people or think that they're stupid or anything like that, which having gone through, and I want to talk to this a little bit too. I've gone through the educational program that makes you, professional managerial, and for a while it really did, like, it instilled some class distinction values in me that took
no,
me a
it's a
while to
heady
like
drug.
find. Hmm?
It's a heady drug. That's why it works so well to divide the
Yeah.
class.
Yep. It's effective, right? And like, you have to, if you go through it, you have to kind of actively rid yourself of it by reminding yourself of, like, good things about the working class, etc. But I think you can overcompensate and pretend that like every element of working class culture is inherently good or pro-social. And I'm like, why would it be? They're like, it's a deracinated position in society. Like, um And I don't say this as a person who's against labor as such. Like, I'm not one of these anti-work Marxist in the sense that I think that, well, I don't know. I'm actually not sure where I am on the pro or anti-work spectrum, because that's one of those debates, like the PMC debate, where people mean different things by it, and you're never really sure if you're actually arguing the same thing.
Yeah, same with degrowth, but
Yeah.
let's not go
Yeah. um, yeah, that's a big one too. So I think we have to look at this as a way to organize the class, because, yeah, Catherine Liu's workerism is deeply unappealing. I'm not gonna lie. But I did read the book. I gave it a mixed review. I agree with some of what McNair said, but I also thought, like, she's on to something. There is something going on there. She doesn't do the work to flesh it out. So far, I've seen people kind of begin to throw out some things that would limit it or talk about the divisions within the PMC themselves. But it's interesting because one of the tragedies of the success of the term is that the more we use it, the harder it is to actually get anyone to sit down and define it, and work it out and talk about it in a clear way. I think Gabriel Winant's been the person who's tried to do that the most, and has come to kind of radically different conclusions from Catherine Liu. But
good.
In general, most people just use it. I mean, it's almost just synonymous in communist circles with liberal shit I don't like. Oh, that's PMC. And I don't think you can do that. One of the reasons why I don't think you can do it is, like, we've talked about professors, but managers outside of HR are not by and large woke. Like, I do not think that the leadership of most corporations are like super duper 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 Robin DiAngelo-y. Like, it just, my experience, unless stuff has changed dramatically in the 15 years that I've been outside of the corporate structure, my experience of that is that no, that is not true. That the politics of middle management is incredibly diverse, actually. So what do you make of that? Like, how would we start to answer this question in a more realistic and scientific way than it is currently being answered? Maybe that'll be our final question for the day.
Which question specifically?
Oh, yeah, I think I did the thing where I riffed and asked like 4 things. Let's break this down. How do we? I guess there's 2 things here. How do we get a better way of dealing with this question of what we see as this PMC and other forms of domination within the class structure of capitalism? How do we come up with a better way to scientifically deal with it, as opposed to these terms like PMC, which have been used so much that even if we wanted to scientifically deal with it, it's going to be hard now?
Yeah, I'm actually not. I mean, just generally, it seems to me has to be a large part of union work. And I mean, that's also within unions. Of course, there's quite a few issues with representation and how union bureaucracies function that have to be addressed for kind of the same reasons.
Mm-hmm.
So that, and the other thing that would probably help a lot to get us started is to just encourage the breaking down of intra-company divisions of pay.
Mm-hmm.
And so to get people to care more about how their co-workers are treated, and to get away from what we have especially in the older industries, just the graded pay and the different scales you have. I mean, I imagine U.S. school system has this as well, They just have different pay scales and different pay grades within that. And
we have it from city to city variance on pay grades and scale, and like the difference in scale depending on where you're at in the country can be massive.
Yeah, and I mean, you have to do something with like cost of living in and around San Francisco if you want to have teachers that can live in San Francisco, and that's true for other parts of the country as well. So there's that, but just reducing the amount of differences and starting discussions about why these exist and how people relate to each other seems to me to be a good way to get conversation started about these differences and about the differences between managerial and non-managerial labor and how they relate to each other. But I don't know if I don't really see a simple solution to this other than just generally being aware of these indirect forms of exploitation and focusing on that in our own agitation and propaganda work and educational work within communist and socialist parties, which is also, of course, largely missing because of probably the Soviet / Comintern Cominform influence, which then fed into the creation of party and union bureaucracies in the West, which want to maintain their own positions.
Yeah, I think that's clear. I'm going to read my favorite paragraph in your essay, and we can riff on that on the way out. So I'm quoting you here for my audience. I thus in no way disagree with McNair that class should be central to our analysis. But we must use a broader definition because we have to keep in mind and communicate clearly that our goal is the abolition of class rule and not just of capitalism. We must stop papering over and ignoring interclass divisions in the name of worker unity, and that's in quotation marks, and be clear that uniting is hard work. Given that the class is marginal or multidimensional use, I would strongly recommend we start talking about class in terms of which immaterial interests people have in supporting or rejecting class rule. How people provide for their subsistence and basic needs affects their commitments and broader lives in major ways, but humans are complex, and this is not the only use value or form of exploitation that matters. Yeah, I think this is key. Focusing only on surplus value and that everything else is completely separate from that. I mean, to me, it kind of pretends that, like, and you hear this from, for those of you who are listening and not watching, I'm putting this word in scare quotes, Marxist, who literally are concerned with that, like, worker rule is the only class rule we're worried about, and that once the bourgeoisie is gone, there's no other classes to deal with. We're only dealing with class rule under capitalism. And I'm like, well, then what's the point? Like, for me, that seems to be like, okay, so I replace one class rule with another because of reasons, I guess. Like, why would I want to do that? Like, unless I thought I was going to be that ruling class, right? Like, but that's dirty pool. So
yeah, I mean, it's a dream that you can become the next Stalin and survive the culling, I guess. It makes sense if you're used to society functioning that way, I suppose.
Well, it's just interesting to me that I would say these people very much are not used to society working that way, because arguing for that kind of inter ideological violence and trauma seems to be a perfect way to make sure that you maintain class rule as opposed to get rid of it. Like,
that's my worry.
Yeah, and also like exhaust the society too, because I mean, like, how many times has Russia lost a third of its men in the 20th century? Like, it ain't great. So thank you, Foppe, for coming on, and I'm gonna put a link in the show notes to your article. People should check it out. I thought it was pretty good. I when I was reading it, I was like, oh, this very much reminded me, and I thought was actually kind of smarter than what I did when I was trying to respond to Mark Fisher's Vampire Castle by going, yeah, Mark, you're right about those assholes, but like maybe you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Like, and what's interesting is like that has become the first volley in a gambit that led to this. I mean, there is a real way in which Mark Fisher's late politics very much presaged this turn we've seen post Bernie to blame the PMC. The two people that we're always blaming but Marxist is the PMC. And if you heard Marxist talk, you would have thought that anarchists were the most common kind of politics on the planet, because we're always blaming anarchists for like why Bernie failed. I'm like, in what world do you live in where like one, that the anarchism in the United States is new, and two, that like even though it's not new, that it's a dominant politics that matters at all. Like,
yeah, no, that's, I mean, that's a big part of what motivated me to write this and to try to get a conversation going about this. It just seems to me very sad that people who mean well, and I mean, Mark is an exceptional case, of course, because of what it did for him and how he ended. But there's just so many people who want to get somewhere, but we don't, because we don't reflect enough on the history of the 20th century and why it went wrong. And the answers to the national question are a very big part of that, but also just the bureaucratization of both the USSR and the Union and communist movements within in the Western countries. There's a lot that was never looked at seriously, because obviously it wasn't in the interest of the people who were running the place at the time to do so. But we're still not really doing that, and still not taking seriously all of the ethnic and gender and every other kind of division that just exists and is an important thing within the working class that we thus must take into account when building a new movement, and that we should have done so before, but we can change that. So let's please start now. So yeah, that, and thank you very much for the invitation and the chance to talk about this. It's very much appreciated.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. And is there any other place where people can find your work? I'm sure I have some listeners that read Dutch, but most of you write in English too. Just want to give you Central Northern Europeans type. You always think your English is bad, and your English is always better than ours. And it really like I don't speak. I just want to like give props to your school system on languages, because like Americans can't speak any other fucking languages ever. Like, you know, I'm proud that I can butcher German and Spanish and Korean, and that's like, you know, and by butcher I do mean butcher. So, but if people want to find your work, where can they find it?
Yeah, well, I have an own blog that's not explicitly communist, but it's just trying. It's beyondmeritocracy.info. I there try to just explore how meritocratic reasoning is expressed in different domains, and I haven't been able to really put up anything new since I became more active politically. So it's sort of defunct, but I still think it was just an interesting way for me to play with meritocracy and meritocratic logic to see how it expressed itself. And otherwise, I most usually write in Dutch, so that's probably and that will be on communisme.nu. It's I'll give you the link.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because
And
You
the
know?
other reason my English is okay is because of American cultural imperialism. So
Yeah, that's
thank you
true.
for that.
That's true. That's fair. Uh, um, you know, also, I mean, our languages are sort of related, kind of.
Yeah,
Um,
kind of.
whenever I read Dutch, it always reads to me like it reads somehow, which I'm reading wrong, by the way. Whenever what I hear in my head when I read Dutch is ridiculous, but it always reads to me like a German who's drunk speaking English when they forgot their school English. That's how Dutch reads to me. Which
Sounds fun.
which I've always wondered, like, what is the reverse of that? What is English like for you guys? You can insult us, it's fine. I feel like
I don't know. It's. I mean, uh, yeah. It's English for me. Is quite diverse anyway because of how many English countries there are and different accents and stuff. So
oh yeah, that's true. I mean, I guess that's I actually don't know much about Dutch accents. Um, so yeah, that's interesting. I mean, English is a great it is like a perfect language for cultural imperialism because we'll just take your words and keep them anyway.
yeah,
Like,
no, I very much like how enormous vocabulary English has. It's, I mean, in Dutch we have much more constructed words, like in German, a bit less. But yeah, it's nice because you stole so much from via Shakespeare and stuff from Latin, and it's a very useful language in that sense. It's just terrible for dyslexics because of spelling and the complete disjunction between spelling and pronunciation.
as a dyslexic and an aphasic, which I am, I
Mm.
completely agree with you. Um, I'm a writer by profession, and actually, I kind of became a poet partly because editing in English is a pain in the ass because you don't know how to spell anything. um, and we don't teach spelling anymore either, by the way, in our school system. So it's just like
Cool.
it's just like, well, without our robot overlords, we can't even write anymore. So like, yeah, that's where we're at. Anyway, thank you so much.
You too.
Yeah, all right.